Brothers and sisters, grace to you and peace from God our Father, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. To understand the passage that we have from Isaiah for today, Caleb, please. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of this man that you see on the right, Yusuf Nardakani. Yusuf Nardakani has spent his entire life in the country of Iran. He was born there, grew up there. He eventually, as a young person, was brought to faith in Jesus Christ, and that ultimately led him to become the pastor of a small church that met out of some people's homes. In 2006, he was arrested for the crime of apostasy. Apostasy is a fancy church word of saying that you are saying something false, untrue, and offensive about a particular religion. And in this case, in the country of Iran, that religion would be Islam. He was arrested for apostasy, for saying things offensive, untrue, and so forth about Islam, and he was put in jail. He was released 2 weeks later. And then he was doing fine, leading his congregation for a while until 2009. His kids were going to school, and during that year, Iran changed its educational policy, and they began to require that all kids in schools attend classes on the Quran. Now, Pastor Nardakani had a problem with this, twofold. One is, as a Christian, that was against what the Christian teaching was, and also, Iran had, as part of its constitution, the guarantee that the freedom to exercise one's religion is part of that culture, part of that world. And so he argued, and he said, listen, we have freedom of religion, and so therefore, I don't want my children to have to participate in this. A couple days later, he was visited by police who brought him to the police station. They threw him in prison, and they charged him with protesting. And so, he's sitting in jail, and then the police go and pick up his wife, Mrs. Nardakani, and they put her in prison. And they charge her with apostasy, again, being offensive against Islam, saying something untrue against Islam. She goes to trial, and she's convicted of a life sentence in prison for her alleged crime. The charges against Pastor Nardakani during this time are changed from merely protesting against the government to apostasy. He is put on trial, and his charge eventually results in a death sentence. So now he's sitting in prison with a death sentence. His wife was able to get out of prison, out from underneath the charges against her, but now he languishes in prison. And he would end up spending the next 3 years with the death sentence literally hanging over his head, not knowing what the next day would bring. And he languished in that prison, and repeatedly during those 3 years, the government, the police would come to him and they would say, listen, we will let you out of prison, we'll drop all the charges, you got to do one thing. You got to say no to Christianity and not practice being a pastor of a Christian house church anymore. And he wouldn't do it. 3 years with a death sentence hanging over his head, multiple times being offered his freedom, multiple times being offered the chance to go back to his wife and his kids and lead a normal life. All you got to do is say, I relinquish anything about Jesus Christ that I stand for, and I will not teach and preach the Christian faith anymore as well. He was eventually freed on September 8, 2012. 3 years again of being in prison. And yet, that wasn't the end of his story. On Christmas Day of 2012, the judge who had presided over his case said, hey, wait a second. Nardakani was released 45 days early, so guess what? He needs to go back and sit in prison for another 45 days and finish out his sentence. At the risk of violating the 8th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness, do you find the day that he was returned to prison at all ironic? And so Nardakani is brought back to prison for another month and a half where he finished out his sentence. How many times during those 1,100 days that he sat in prison with a death sentence hanging over his head must he have thought about whether or not God was still doing anything on his behalf? How many times must Pastor Nardakani, on day 23, on day 67, day 178, day 936, was it possible that he ever had a problem and thought, you know what? Obviously, what I'm going through is too insignificant for God to be paying attention to and for God to be caring about. He even writes a little bit. He's got some letters out of prison. And in one of the letters that he wrote, he said, "And during these days, which are hard in order to prove your loyalty and sincerity to God." He also said, "As in the flesh, I wish these days to end." Pastor Nardakani, in 1,000+ days of imprisonment, struggled. Didn't know what was going to happen the next day. Didn't know what was going to happen to his wife. They threw his wife in prison once already. Who said they couldn't do it again? What would happen to his kids? And in the midst of all of this never-ending torment, where is God? Is what he is experiencing, is it just too insignificant for God to even be paying attention to? And so in order to understand today's lesson from Isaiah, I think we need to put ourselves in Pastor Nardakani's shoes. And we need to be able to relate to that separation that he experienced from his family. Again, guys, 3 years. Didn't see his wife or his kids for 3 years. I've oftentimes thought about this. Could I put up with being separated from Rosemary and the boys for that long? Could I be separated from Rosemary and the boys for a month? I don't think I could. Especially when the government keeps coming back to me and saying, "Hey, Andrew, we'll let you out. We'll drop all the charges. No harm, no foul. All you got to do is say no to Christ and say no to the ministry that you provide." There is the serpent talking into a person's ear and saying, all you got to do is this, and it's all over. That would be tempting not to bite that fruit. In order to understand today's lesson from Isaiah, I think we need to recognize the length of time that Pastor Nardakani suffered. Again, guys, 3 years. And by the way, as he's sitting in prison, he doesn't know how long this is going to last. He just knows that it's an open-ended deal. He doesn't know when it's going to end. And that's the problem. Because he's under a death sentence, he doesn't know when that day is going to come, when it's going to end in an earthly way permanently for him. In order to understand today's lesson from Isaiah, I think we need to identify with that challenge of what it must be like to be tempted to give up your faith in Jesus Christ. How easy that would be to give into that. How tempting that would be to say, I've had it after day 657. Almost 2+ years of being away from my family. Done. I want my get out of jail free card. I want to go back to my house, and I will cobble together a life with my wife and my kids that I can survive. How tempting it would be to give up your faith in Jesus Christ because that is being dangled in front of you. And so as we pick up today's lesson in Isaiah, these are the kinds of things that God's people are going through. God's people, as we pick up this part of Isaiah, are nearing the end of their exile in Babylon. They have been exiled from Israel, and they've been in Babylon for about 7 years, almost 7 decades. And they're nearing the end of that time before they're returned back to the Holy Land, but they're not there yet when we get to today's passage. They've been separated from their families. They've suffered 70 years of this, so a length of time, and their faith has been challenged. They've been in a place that's not been home. They've been compelled to go there against their will, and their faith has been challenged. And into all of this, the obvious question after 7 decades, among the people, the obvious question was, where's God? Is what we are enduring, has that become too insignificant for God to be paying attention to this anymore? Does God even care? Does God even know that we're still here in Babylon? And into that obvious question, what does God say? Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord? my cause is disregarded by my God. God says through the prophet Isaiah, why do you complain, my people, Jacob, Israel, God's people? Why are you guys complaining? Why do you say that what you're going through is hidden and that it's being disregarded? I don't know, God, because we're still here. Because it's been 7 decades that we've been going through this. 70 times 365, do the math, 23,000. We've been doing this day after day after day, and there's no change in sight. And so this is the question that God asks his people. But the people's question was a fair one. God comes back to the people through Isaiah and says, listen, why are you saying this? Why do you think I've disregarded you? And yet their question is a fair one. The reason why the people were sent into exile in the first place is that Israel had over time turned into a place that had violated rule number 1 of the top 10. They had started to worship other foreign gods. There was corruption among their ranks, and God said, enough. And he decided that he needed to punish his people, purify his people, and so he allowed this foreign power to come in, take over his people, and part of that conquering of them was to send them into exile, to forcibly uproot them from their homes in Israel and move them to Babylon and say, here you go, this is where you've got to live. And so their question has been a fair one, because as much as they had committed the sin of false idolatry, listen, there were people all over the world who were false idolaters. You look around the people of Israel in that day and age, they're worshiping golden calves, they're worshiping statues of ladies, they're doing all kinds of things. And so, wait a second, God, how come you're punishing us when you're not punishing them? How fair is that? Was it right also that those people who had committed the sins were being punished in the same way that people who had worshipped God only had not? In other words, within God's people at that time, there had been people who had worshipped God faithfully, and they were part of that group that got exiled to Babylon. How fair was that? The people are sitting there and they're saying to themselves, hey, listen, fine, we committed a sin, but the punishment should fit the crime. Isn't 70 years a little excessive here? We're still languishing in this foreign country after 7 decades. Guys, that's almost 3 generations. Come on, God. And most importantly, going back, is after 70 years, do the people ever sit there and say to themselves, this is never going to end? And you know what that means? God has forgotten. God has decided that what we're going through is too insignificant to be worthy of his care. And to that question of whether or not God had forgotten them, if God had just said, you know what, it's not even worth my bother, God comes back today and he offers an emphatic answer of no. He has not forgotten his people. Their concerns are not too insignificant for him. And what he says today is this: lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all this? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Not one of them is missing. And what God is saying here is this: God himself, by the way, is the one who is speaking through the prophet Isaiah. What the people hear when Isaiah speaks is God's own voice. God doesn't say to Isaiah, hey, listen, I'm going to tell you what to say, and then you tell him you said it. No. What the people hear through Isaiah is God himself speaking. This is a dynamic. This is an alive God who is speaking to his people in real time. And what he is telling them today is that he is the one who created the stars. He is the one who called each of the stars into being out of nothing. God simply said, let there be, and boom, there it was. And God also gave each of those stars names. God knows the name of every single star that he created, and God even went as far as to figure out where in the heavens, where in the universe to place each one of those stars. What that says, my friends, is that God is telling his people right out of the gate this morning that he is a very detail-oriented God. He is alive, he is active, and he is very attentive to the details of the world. And if he is a detail-oriented God, he is the kind of God who, as Jesus would later on say, years later, he's the kind of God who even knows when one single sparrow falls from the sky to the ground. He is the God who knows how many hairs are on your individual heads. Jesus follows and says, so do not be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. We are dealing with a God who knows what's going on in the world, in every single situation that we find ourselves in, and he knows it down to the finest minutia. God is a detail-oriented God. And so God had not forgotten his people, he says today. In fact, in the very same breath that he tells them, listen, I'm the God who put all these stars into heavens, named them, set them where they're supposed to be, he offers to his people grace and a gift in that very same breath. Do you not know? Have you not heard? He will not grow tired or weary. And his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. These people are tired. These people have had it. These people have suffered for 7 decades. And they want to know, does God care? And God's emphatic answer to them, my friend, is absolutely I care. I've been paying attention to every single detail. And what I promise you, my friends, is this. I will not grow tired or weary, and I will give strength to those of you who are tired, and I will increase the power of those of you who have grown weak. This is a God who not only says to his people, I've got this under control, but I'm going to give you something as well. The tone that God uses here, folks, is crucial. Because in the face of their complaints, in the face of their concerns, God does not come to his people today with a tone of scolding or of shame. God does not come to his people and remind them, oh, you guys are upset. You guys think you're in pain. Well, I don't know if you remember, but you guys sinned. I told you one thing. Do not worship any other God besides me, and guess what? You guys did it anyway. God does not come to his people with that tone. He also doesn't tell them to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, and hey guys, if you just believed a little bit more, if you just could get your act together, then we wouldn't have this problem in the first place. Guys, this is not the tone that God uses with his people. In the face of their frustration, in the face of their fear, their fatigue, and they're being just tired, God comes to them and he declares through Isaiah a word of refreshing hope and promise. This uber detail-oriented God has not forgotten them, and he will help them. That is his promise, and he will do that. We need very, very briefly, and I'll say this from the outset very incompletely, to pause for a second and talk about why suffering now. Why is it that these people were going through this stuff in the first place? Why does a guy like Pastor Nardicani and Mrs. Nardicani have to go through this garbage in the first place in order to see that God is paying attention to them? Guys, here's the problem. With the time that we have here this morning, this is going to be a very, very incomplete answer. This is tantamount to the kind of image, the kind of full picture you get while you're driving 60 miles an hour down the highway and looking in your side mirror in your car. The image that you see in a side mirror of your car when you're going that fast is not a complete image. You get a glimpse of part of what the truth is behind you. This is what we're offering this morning. And especially when we're talking about these tragedies that happened in California with that family, school tragedies, Las Vegas, we need to be very careful and sensitive about what we say. But here's an idea to think about. Why is it that somebody like Pastor Nardicani had to suffer in the way he did? Why did God's people have to suffer in the way they did for 70 years? And part of that whole answer might be that what God does is he allows these kinds of sufferings to occur. And he allows them to occur only for a time, for a limited, finite amount of time. Because in order for us to appreciate the brokenness, the sin, the evil that is part of our world, and to see it, sometimes we need to endure part of that too. And so in the case of Pastor Nardikani, part of the answer, and again, I say this with fear and trepidation because I don't want this to sound like a complete answer. Part of that answer is that it is perhaps that he went through that suffering. Because in order for us to fully appreciate what God can do through his servants, we have to expose evil, repression. We have to expose those who turn against Christ for what that is. In the case of God's people, they suffered. And you know what? Some people who had been very faithful suffered along with them. But why? And perhaps part of the answer, not the whole thing, is that in order for God to show his people and to show us as we sit here on February 4, 2018, God allows this to happen so that we can actually see that when we turn against God, things don't go well for us. And so again, my friends, this is possibly why, part of it, this kind of suffering happens. And yet, in spite of it, what is the message that carries today? The message that carries today is that this uber detail-oriented God will not forget his people ever. And he will always help them out. Which brings us back to Pastor Nardikani and the 1,100 days that he sat in prison. Part of that letter that he wrote, he said, I'm trying to remind my beloveds, though my trial due has been so long, and as in the flesh I wish these days to end, yet I have surrendered myself to God's will. Might Pastor Nardikani have wrestled with the idea once, multiple times during his imprisonment, that God had forgotten, that his pain and suffering was too insignificant for God to pay attention to? And the emphatic answer that God gives Pastor Nardikani through Nardikani's own words is that God absolutely was paying attention specifically to what Yusuf was going through, and he was attentive to Pastor Nardikani during that time in prison. He was not forgotten. I will say this too. There are reports that during his imprisonment, as part of their effort to try and get Nardikani to recant, to give up on his Christian faith, that his jailers drugged him, tried to get him into an altered state of mind so that he would offer a taking back of his Christian faith, sign a confession, and they'd say, see, he gave up his faith. The reports say that that happened. The reports also say that even in that altered state of mind, Nardikani would never give up his faith in Jesus Christ. That, my friends, I would submit to you, is evidence of God's Holy Spirit in that place, in those times, with that beloved man, to bear witness to the truth of what God is doing through Jesus Christ, and to give us an example of what that looks like in the midst of terrible suffering and turmoil. And so this comes back to us. We go through times of incredible suffering. We go through times when we are not sure that the things we're enduring are the kinds of things that God cares about or is paying attention to. And as it was for God's people, as it was for Yusuf Nardikani, this is true for you too. Yours is the detail-oriented God who has created the stars themselves. He has named them. He has set them into their places in the heavens, and he has fixed that spot. And yours is the God who will not ever give up on you. And there is nothing that you endure that is too insignificant for him to pay attention to. Charlotte Bronte was an author back in the early 1830s, an English author. And during one point in her life, she was going through a terribly difficult time. She had two sisters. one of whom who had died not too long before, and another sister who was very sick, and who it seemed almost certain was going to succumb to death as well. In a letter to a friend, she said this about being around and dealing with her sister's death and the certain death of her other sister. I avoid looking forward or backward, and I try to look upward. The days pass in a slow, dark march. The nights are a test. The received knowledge that one lies in her grave and another at my side. That was suffering. She already had one sister who was in the grave. She knew that another sister who was no longer by her side would die soon. And yet, instead of looking backwards towards what was, forward to what she couldn't see, Charlotte Bronte tells her friend that she looks upward. And she declares, God is over all. Friends, as we speak, we've got friends of ours in this community who are going through this very thing. Their young son is in a dire situation. And as we prepare to pray for them, as we consider our own lives, we stand here in the midst sometimes of incredible suffering and pain. And yet what our God declares to us today, as he did to his people a couple thousand years ago, as he has done through our brother Yusuf Nardakani 10 years ago, and as he does to this family today, there is nothing that he is not paying attention to. There is nothing that will keep him from bringing his presence, his love, and his promise through Jesus Christ to anybody, in any lot they find themselves in. And to that, we give God all of our glory and all of our praise.